1951, the Utah National Guard, the very first intelligence-oriented type unit was organized, and that was the 1st Observation Battalion, which was a field artillery battalion. And the whole purpose of that unit was to locate enemy artillery on the battlefield. It was a very tactical kind of intelligence group. It was later redesignated the 1st Battalion of the 140th Field Artillery, and it's since been disbanded and merged as the different organizations go along. But the first real organization dedicated towards what we would consider as military intelligence was organized in 1960, and that was the 142nd Military Intelligence Battalion. And it was unique in the U.S. Army at the time. It had all of these linguistic skills because of the missionary school and missionary program, and this was a resource-rich environment here in Utah to establish that kind of a unit. And the purpose of the organization was interpretation, to go along with other units that deploy overseas that serve as interpreters, also as interrogators, and also to translate captured documents. And that's the major mission today of those Utah National Guard units still is that. Then in 1987, the Army took a major step and they developed a military intelligence corps. Up until then, other branches, officers like infantry and artillery, were put into intelligence units to do that, but there was no distinct branch for military intelligence officers and enlisted. From that point on, then, you could go into the Army and you could have a career pattern being in military intelligence. A year later, the 2nd Battalion of Military Intelligence, the 141st, was organized in Utah, again because we had this rich resource, and the demand was becoming greater. And immediately following that, then, a full brigade headquarters was organized for command and control of those two organizations. That was the 300th Military Intelligence Brigade. Today, in addition to that, our 19th Special Forces have got a surveillance platoon that has truck-launched drones and also hand-launched drones. And so that constitutes today pretty much the capability from a combat point of view of acquiring military intelligence that the Utah National Guard has. Now, my guest speaker, we're going to now go into the next step, which is how did we get the NSA Center? And this occurred during the 12 years that Major General Brian Tarbett was the Adjutant General. And I'm going to just quickly give you a little idea of his career. Most of his career has been in the military intelligence arena. He joined the Army in 1973, got into the Guard in 1976, and then he was appointed as the commander of that very first MI battalion, the 142nd, in 1989. And then 4 years later, he takes over the brigade as he's moving up the chain. He spends a little time in troop command, and then in 2000, he is appointed by the governor as the Adjutant General of the Utah National Guard, which, in probably more familiar terms, you would think of as being the commander of the troops of the Utah National Guard, which consists of 2,500 some airmen and soldiers. And then he retired in 2013. During his tenure as the Adjutant General, that was probably one of the most difficult and stressful periods that the Utah National Guard has gone through in its entire history. General Tarbett became known as a soldier's soldier. He has a deep concern for his soldiers, airmen, and their families, and I know that probably was an extremely stressful period for him also, getting through that period, but he did an outstanding job. He retired in 2013, and he currently is the Chief Civil Deputy, Civil Department in the Attorney General's office, and you may have seen him on the news for a brief period of time as the Acting Attorney General in Utah a few months ago. So with that then, sir, I'll turn this over to you.
I don't have any pretty slides to show you. These NSA people are secretive, so I won't give any slides. I thought this was a non-controversial topic at one point, that we all could come here and brag about bringing the largest construction project in Utah history here. I learned differently. During my brilliant but abortive 8-day campaign to be the Attorney General last winter, I was calling all the members of the Republican Central Committee, asking for their support. I learned then that NSA is a hiss of the byword in certain circles, and that I probably had to explain what I did. Well, I explained what I did in simple terms. Said, yeah, along with 2 Republican governors, 2 Republican senators, 2 Republican congressmen, Jim Matheson, Rocky Mountain Power, a lot of other people, yeah, we worked really hard to get that project here. And we did. And I'll give you the history of that. We go back a long way at Utah Guard in a relationship with the National Security Agency. For those that may not know what they do, they intercept and translate voice transmissions, among other things. And they've had a lot of scandalous press in the past, books written about them, calling it the Puzzle Palace and whatnot. But our piece of that was pretty small. We in Utah, and Bob explained it, we do language pretty well here. That's a thing that's an issue that the Chamber of Commerce drives, the Governor's Office of Economic Development drives as we try to lure companies here. That's a big deal. We have wonderful language departments at our universities up and down the state, preeminent language departments. Well, we're the beneficiary of some of that in the Guard, and over the years, we went from a small company of about 100 soldiers to about 1,000 now, with another couple of hundred in the Air Guard. And then we have responsibility for linguist battalions all over the country as guardsmen. Back in 1991, about the time we were working the first Gulf War, we were in the process of trying to get training relationships with active duty Army units. And the Army doesn't do language well. In fact, it does it poorly. And so Utah kind of became the beacon for how it gets done. And so one of these agencies that needed some help and that relies very heavily on language is the National Security Agency. And so back in 1991, we tied one of our small companies of about 100 people to the National Security Agency to provide them language support. Angie, you correct me whenever I go too far off the rails.
Oh, no.
Angie's one of my former soldiers who did much to build those linguist units here. Is now retired from the military, but she was there through a lot of this. So we attempted to forge a training relationship, and in fact did so. And one of our little proud pictures is we're standing there with the 4-star admiral and all of our soldiers, and we have a lovely little photo of that. He forgot it, we never did. But, so that's when it started. We would relate with them, work with them, our soldiers would go back, we would provide language support in multiple languages. Along about the mid-2000s, the NSA came out here to approach us about forming a little more of a relationship. And we engaged in some discussions with them, and they wanted to partner with us. And we're a military organization, obviously, the Guard. But NSA is chiefly civilian dominated, although there's a significant slice of uniformed personnel that works with it. But they wanted to come out here, tap this rich vein of language ability that Utah has, and so we agreed to host them in one of our facilities, and we built what they call a secure facility, meaning you can't get in and out of it, that you can't overhear the conversations. It's what you have to do whenever you're working top secret information. They're called SCIFs, Secure Compartmented Something Facility. Information facility. So we enlarged ours, and they then began to hire civilians, many of whom were our soldiers who would work for NSA in the day, and then they would be guardsmen on the weekend, One of my favorite screensavers from all of the Gulf War is one of those brown vehicles driving along the dusty roads in the Middle East, full of reservists, and the sign said, "A weekend, a month, my ass." That was on the windshield. Well, we all learned it was really more than that. And so we then began to partner and build that facility with the NSA. They didn't hire a lot of our people. They hired maybe 10–20% of them, and about 50 or 60 of them, all told. And they prosecute real-world intelligence missions. The interesting thing about intelligence and the way technology works today is you can work in the war fight and you don't need to be there. These remoting, the signals are sent via satellite, and so people can work. And I can sell this sort of stuff now because I don't work for anybody anymore, so, I don't have a security clearance. You all know what I'm talking about. Is that technology has changed. It's changed in the newspaper industry, it's changed in libraries and academia, it has just changed. Enormous amounts of information. So along came this data center. And this happens for the most accidental of reasons. We had one of our enlisted guys, an E6, middle-ranking guy on the enlisted side, go to a conference somewhere. And he heard that the NSA was going to build a data center. And being a good intel guy, he came back and kicked us in the pant leg and started, we need to do this. We need to put in for this. And they'd go away. We're big shots. We can't listen to this. We're important guys. He kept it up. So if the truth's known why that building sits out there today, it's because of the persistence of one great young enlisted member of the Utah National Guard who said, why not us? Why shouldn't we do it? So then we finally got around to it, and this would have been the local guy that runs the NSA, and some of my people in the facility side of the house. We started to put together a proposal. Yeah, we could host that here. And our contribution would be some acreage at Camp Williams. Now, see, that's not a bad deal for me. We don't own it anyway. The federal government already owns all of it, except for little parcels of state property for the most part. The ground in question happened to be just off of Redwood Road, and we all know where it is. But we used to have a runway out there, a small tactical runway, a dirt runway, if you will, where we would bring in tactical aircraft, they would land. And with the building of the new Mountain View corridor, when it goes through, it will render that runway no longer usable. And it'll probably, I think that highway schedule will go through sometime in the next decade. So we were essentially giving up a runway that we couldn't use anyway. It did morph from the initial ask for 80 acres up to about 200. But that was the Utah Guard's contribution, to give up our claim to that. Camp Williams is owned by the Bureau of Land Management, and the Corps of Engineers handles all the transactions, and so that's who we worked with to do that. That was the huge inducement, if you will. So it wasn't much, because a lot of other states were offering property as well on big military reservations. Washington State, in Oregon, heaven knows California's got a lot of desert areas. So this, when the word came out that this was going to be built about $2 billion, there were a lot of suitors. A project that big can't just get done like, okay, Utah, you can have it. I mean, once the word got out, there became a competitive process. Some 35 sites vied for the project. It was reduced down to 15, and we ultimately prevailed. This would have been late in the last decade, 2009 timeframe. Was this a political process? Sure it was. I mean, of course it was. But you had to have the technical case there as well. And what made Utah desirable was the location. First of all, this is not a language-related facility, so that particular inducement does not pertain to a data center. But many of you probably know there are a lot of data centers in Utah. Major corporations have sided here. That's because we have bandwidth, connectivity to the grid, if you will. We have excellent power rates here in Utah, very competitive. The lowest? No, they're not the lowest, but they're modest by comparison. The ground was certainly an inducement because it was free, and then we had to work the water piece as well, to have one of the surrounding municipalities provide us with water. So ultimately in 2010, We were selected as the site preparation began, and that was done by a quasi-governmental agency, military installation development agency here in Utah. Did about $300 million worth of site prep. They moved a lot of dirt and essentially cut that mountain down, flattened it out, and shaped it. And then the construction in earnest began of the data center. We worked really hard to do that in terms of trying to sell Utah. Both, chiefly Governor Huntsman did this because this happened from about 2005 on through 2009. In the transition in 2029, when Huntsman left, we went right to work with Governor Herbert to make sure we didn't drop the baton on this. Both senators were extremely engaged in this process. Hatch doing some of the intelligence side of the work, Bennett more on the appropriations and authorization side. And all three congressmen worked very well together. At that time, the House was in the hands of the Democrats, and Jim Matheson was invaluable in helping bridge over to leadership there, so that whatever legislation we had to run, we were able to run. So the delegation worked harmoniously, absolutely apolitically, to develop that project here. Now, what does that mean for the state? What was the magnitude of this? And of course, I don't have all those kind of figures, but I got them. The project is about $2 billion when it's finished out. About $1.3 million for the building, about $300 million for site prep, $1.3 billion. I'm missing that. And then as you put on the computers and whatnot, it takes the price tag up to around $2 billion. The payroll was $430 million. 5,000 Utah craftsmen worked on that building over the course of its construction. It was essentially a joint venture. This was a big project, and like many projects of this scope, no one company takes it. The biggest one locally was Big D, with an outfit called BDB, a national firm, and then a firm that specialized in data centers, Balfour Beatty, was part of that triumvirate that ultimately built this project. The project is now up and running. It'll employ 200 odd souls as it goes forward. But it does spawn a lot of vendor support on the periphery of the project, so you'll see additional input and multiplication of effort beyond that as this thing gets built out and it's done. I thought this was something we could always feel really good about in Utah. And then I found out that, well, otherwise. I still feel really good about it. Glad that the small role that I could play in it. We pursued them and wooed them aggressively in the initial stages. But once you get into a project that big with a competitive process that wide, Utah won this on its merits. The merits, I think, were the power rates, the ground, and the proximity to the lines, and that the infrastructure was virtually there. NSA paid every cent of this on its way. A lot of infrastructure improvements that will benefit other projects have been put in place to host this one. We had great cooperation from the municipalities. Everybody, I think the word goes out that we're using the only electricity in the entire state out there. My understanding is it's about the 5th or 6th biggest user of electricity in the state. The water is also controversial from time to time. The water is used 5 times in the chilling towers, and then what isn't used in that cooling process is returned to Bluffdale City and put in their secondary water system. So there's virtually no waste. The project was built to the highest environmental and energy certifications. It's a silver certification. Angie, what's that LEED certification? It's LEED silver.
LEED silver.
And so they spared no effort to make sure that it was environmentally conscious and the prudent use of the electricity. I wish they were here to tell you what goes on in there, which of course they couldn't, but it's data storage, folks. So, that said, I'll be glad to entertain any questions you might have. No, Angie, you don't get to ask questions. Go ahead, what?
Well, the presentation before yours was about the technology, and a lot of this conference has been that technology and the computer sciences in Utah. Do you think that was any part of the sales, having an educated workforce here that could help them because it's significant?
No, it was. Certainly, they were familiar with the universities because they had visited many of them in talking about the language end of it. But they also know that Utah's pretty high speed in terms of the computer and IT systems. It was essentially proximity to those big trunk lines, the big fiber optic lines. They're right there and right by. So I think it was a host of things that tipped the balance in our favor. That's certainly one of them. I mean, do we have the reputation that Austin does or Silicon Valley? I doubt it, but we have a good one. And we do have an educated workforce, and one that's very focuses on education and acquiring additional education. Ma'am?
You said earlier that they had a lot of deserts in California. Were you implying that they wanted to place this facility
No,
in?
just open space.
Just open space? But
Ground of limited value.
Because Silicon Valley does not have any
No.
open space.
I didn't mean to imply that. They don't need a lot of acreage, but it is a big building. And one of the other suitors was the state of Washington up in the Tri-Cities area, where they had the big Hanford nuclear reactor, a lot of acreage up there, again, kind of a desert location. So it was simply because the price was right in terms of the ground. Free is always good when it comes to ground. Ma'am?
The 200 odd employees that work there, were they brought into Utah, or do they go to Utahns?
I can't answer that.
I know.
But I think there are a lot of Utahns working there. There are also Utahns who went somewhere else career-wise and viewed this as an opportunity to come back. A lot of NSA people who work in that area want to come home. I think some of them transferred back home, a lot of them were hired, and I'm not sure all the hiring's done yet. I couldn't comment on the hiring practices. They're going to take the best available athlete, I'm sure is what they do. Sir.
Major General Target, you were describing sort of I think, and help me if I'm wrong, that it was the language issues that got NSA interested in Utah and creating a relationship.
Initially, had nothing to do with this project.
But it created an opportunity for the agency to get to know the National Guard here in Utah.
Well, they kind of knew Utah. They knew why we did language better. They came out here initially to see if they could tap that vein, hire some linguists, and that's what brought them here initially. That had nothing to do with this.
He'll fix that for you right there. Kind of stabilize it so it's a little easier.
Clever, these Americans. Okay. That had nothing to do ultimately with the data center, but it put us in that circle that we knew of it and were then able to move from there. And so NSA is familiar with Utah, familiar mostly for its language aptitude. This other case was made simply on the merits of a data center location.
Could you speak to the issue of the municipal negotiations with the city that it's in? How
Well,
did that all
yeah.
evolve?
Well, I can't tell you where that ended exactly, but you've got about 3 municipalities that butt right up there: Saratoga Springs, Lehigh, and Bluffdale. And so we had to run some sewer trunk lines out there to take care of that, as well as the water issue. And I know the water comes from Bluffdale. And so there was a lot of pipe laid. If memory serves, the sewer was taken care of by the Utah County municipalities. That would be consistent with the slope out there. But the water comes up from Bluffdale, and the pressure is in a big storage tank. And I think Bluffdale benefited by getting a big tank put in for them to run this facility that benefits the city. I think most of the municipal folks feel this was a pretty good deal for them, and NSA is an excellent neighbor. Ma'am?
Was any of the controversy have to do with it might put a target on Utah's back if it's strategic to have all that data?
Could you
coming
repeat
in?
the question?
The question is, what would the location of the data center make Utah a target? No more so than Hill Air Force Base already is. And I remember growing up in Cache Valley, we always cast our eyes south. We'll wait for the mushroom clouds to wave gently up over the hills. It didn't. The hill was always there. Duckway's there. This is another issue, but probably not from a kinetic perspective. But there are a lot of people, foreign countries, that watch this facility, and so keep an eye on it, ma'am.
When will it be fully operational?
It might be now. Again, I've been away from it for a couple of years now. I think they're up and running, but I think there's 4 halls, as they call them, and they stood them up in sequence. I think they're all up and going now. I just don't know. That's why I wish they were here. And of course, then they would be forbidden to speak.
You talked about thinking that this was an issue-free project in the beginning, but I have heard people complaining about it being there. Do you foresee any problems down the road because of that?
Well, I hope not. No, I don't. I think, since the Snowden episode of about a year ago, the NSA is wildly misunderstood, and I'm not going to be an apologist for them, because I'm not professionally capable to do that. I'm not in their business. My job was to provide trained and ready soldiers to go work with them. We did that. I think it is an enormously important piece of our national security strategy, what they perform there. And in turn, that facility is a part of that piece. A lot of why this was done is to create what they call redundancy. Because if some of these data centers are compromised, or NSA is compromised, NSA sits right at the corner of the Washington-Baltimore Parkway and Route 32 in Maryland. All you have to do is drive up with a really big truck filled with something, and you could do a lot of damage there and not get anywhere on to the military reservation. So they've seen a need to create redundancy so that in the event of attack, they're not shut down. That's a piece of that. It is controversial, and I don't laugh about it because I find it intriguing, but there were bills that ran in the last legislative session to cut off the water and to tax the NSA. Now, my professional background was as a tax attorney working for the state. There is a doctrine called intergovernmental tax immunity. They don't tax us, we don't tax them. It's sort of how this works. And there's a host of federalism questions here that get brought up by this kind of thing, but we don't tax the federal courthouses here or the other federal facilities. It's just kind of curious why they would like to single out the NSA and have them pay, quote, their fair share. So it is controversial, no question about it, and I anticipate seeing that kind of legislation run again this year. Ma'am.
It seems like some of the hostility was because there wasn't a whole lot of information out there about it until it was there. Is that just my perception, or was there a lot of information about what was going on?
I think it was pretty widely known. We had municipality days, government days. Many elected government people were brought out there. There were ribbon cutting ceremonies that were open to the public. It was the worst kept secret in Utah history. But is this an agency that adroitly deals with public relations? No. No. So, other questions? Well, it's been nice to be with you this afternoon. Oh, and you're going to get out
I have one
early.
more question. Is there any room for expansion out there?
Of this facility? It's pretty tight. It's pretty tight. You see, you're hemmed in by that road and by the mountains of Camp Williams. And candidly, Camp Williams is still an operating military facility. My soldiers have informed me that the innocent people have tried to arrest them from time to time. So to say that we even get along may be a stretch. But probably just a misunderstanding. Sir?
What does it impact the fort, or the, Fort Williams? Fort Williams?
Camp
Camp
Williams.
Williams, I knew I was saying that wrong. Camp Williams, do you have, facilities now, restaurants, I mean, are they all self-contained or do they interact in some way with the camp?
Self-contained. They can come onto our place, we don't go onto theirs. Other than our soldiers who work there, and there are many that do that. Part of my rationale in getting in bed with these folks was Camp Williams is an interesting place. We celebrate this year our 100th year in May. Woodrow Wilson signed the deed reserving this as a military reservation for the military. Think of it as a thumb. And that thumb used to be out there. There was nobody south of us, very few people east of us, and the little podunk town of Harriman to the north of us, and that was about it. Over the past 20 years, we are literally encircled now by development. We call it encroachment, they call it development. But it has become a much different issue. And you may remember I'm the man that burned down the town of Harriman. And so I have a keen understanding of how close that is. And it's a challenge because Camp Williams burns. 80% of the fires out there are lightning caused. But we do, in the military, cause fires from time to time. And it's a very big challenge to fight them. The reason being, most of the winds that causes trouble are from the south, not surprisingly. We have a big impact range out there where our artillery rounds land. And you can't go fighting fire out on that impact area because not all the rounds explode. And the fire will occasionally cook off a round. And if you got a helicopter up there with a thing of water, it could bring down that helicopter and crew and kill them. And nobody on the ground's going to fight there. So we basically have to wait until the fire comes out of the impact area. By then we have 1 mile to fight it on the north perimeter of the military reservation. And then you're in Rose Canyon, which is county, or you're in Harriman. And Harriman's they've been wonderful neighbors. We work with them. We're trying to work access issues so that we can fight. But you know what? Developers simply don't want to reserve 5 or 10 acres out of their 40 acres for us to drive by with fire trucks. So what tends to happen is the houses get built right on the perimeter. That's life. It's not sinister, it's not evil, it's the way it is. People in this country have the right to do what they want to with their property. And giving it to Camp Williams for a buffer zone is not chief among what developers want to do. So there's some challenges there, but we work harmoniously with the cities, and the folks of Harriman were great dealing with the aftermath of the fire.
You mentioned a young fellow who you said was the initial spark, or the fellow who pushed this along. Is that someone you can tell us his name?
No, nor would I. Given how controversial this has become, I'm not trying to get him.
I'm just speaking
No,
of historical record.
I'm just pointing out that it was like most good things. It was some innovative thinking young person and organization that basically had to go and grab their superiors by their lapels and say, listen to me, this is a good idea. And that's really, truly how this evolved. Ma'am?
Were there any, geological elements of the area that was decision driving?
Meaning, are we on a fault line?
Well, yeah, I guess, or just the water supply, or,
No, they
what were the implications
They
geologically for the
looked,
construction?
obviously, they looked at the seismic data and whatnot. We sit pretty solidly out of Camp Williams. Most of the faults are on the other side of the valley.
Yeah.
So they took a look at that. One of the big issues they had to deal with was remediation. Over the years, there's been a lot of military training at Camp Williams. We didn't keep real good records on where that all happened. And so whenever we have a fire, you'll sit there and listen to it, and you're listening to rounds go off. Now, if you're a firefighter, that can be alarming. Or if you're sitting on your truck listening, they get too close. So we don't know where all the, what they call unexploded ordnance is. It took quite a bit for them to remediate that parcel of property. In other words, you have to go through, find any unexploded ordnance and remove it. And we had to clean that property up, or they did, they paid for it. And
Did they find a lot of unexploded ordnance in that last remediation? I used to do stomp and drags all the time over the years
Yeah, quite a bit.
on that same hillside.
quite a bit.
Quite a bit,
Enough that they had to do it.
interesting.
And actually, there is some unexploded ordnance on the east side of Red River Road, believe it or not, because they used to go down there. By unexploded ordnance, I'm talking about rounds, the small arms rounds on that side. But, 100 years, we don't keep the best records, and we do now, but we didn't then. So there's always a surprise when you're digging trenches or whatever out there. But it's a remarkable facility for training soldiers. That close to a metropolitan area where most of our folks live. I've had guys come up to me and say, why don't you guys move out to Dugway? Well, part of the reason for NSA was that will help protect that. That should be a secure facility dedicated for military use from now until we don't have to worry about it anymore. So, questions, sir?
Can you tell us why, give us some of the reasons why this has become so controversial? Does it have to do with the Snowden revelations, or why is the legislature in particular so antagonistic against it?
You'd have to ask them. My guess is that's what it is. That everybody thinks they're out there collecting every phone call you've got. Now, I don't want to speak to that because they do sweep up a tremendous amount of information, but they don't look at it without a warrant. And without a warrant, you have to have probable cause to get it, and you go through the FISA court. Some say it's a rubber stamp court. And again, folks, I'm not in that operational end of it, so I'm telling you what I read in the papers, but they're simply not looking at Target, Home Depot. They know a whole lot more about you than the NSA does. If you've ever noticed when you get online and book a room, and then all of a sudden stuff gets pushed to you. You coming to Vegas this weekend? I mean, it's crazy. These data centers just sweep up a lot of information. And you as a customer, every time you swipe that credit card, you are establishing a profile. NSA knows less about you than they do. And I'm sorry to say, cares even less about you. I told some of those folks who were upset with me last winter, I said, unless you're talking to the drug cartel or a known terrorist in the Middle East, ain't nobody looking at your data. And that's the sad truth of it. It just doesn't trip the wire and you have no cause to do so. Sir?
It's sort of a broader question, and maybe you're not the right person to address it. But
I'm sure I'm not.
But I mean, one argument I've heard recently when it pertains more to intelligence in general is this growth of big data versus, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were more sort of area study-based programs, language-based, you could argue, BYU. And how would you can't look back now from 100 years in the future, but...
Well, I can, I'm that old.
But this idea of big data equals better intelligence is just...
I don't share it. The challenge we have now is finding the needle in the haystack. And the haystack's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and our ability to find the needle has not improved that much. It's a huge challenge. This sifting. We knew everything we needed to know about the 9/11 plot, but it was all in different parts of the government and not pulled together. There were walls and stovepipes and whatever else they called them. That challenge is still there. And so Intel's a very difficult business today, simply to winnow and separate the wheat from the chaff. Much more difficult. So now they establish patterns. They look at this is a known terrorist. Who's the known terrorist calling? That's kind of how this has to proceed at this point. And if that known terrorist starts calling you in Salt Lake, that's when you might get a warrant issued and have your stuff looked at. And again, I'm speculating there. I don't know that. Ma'am?
Just one more. Airspace. How does it affect airspace? Does it?
Airspace is funny. Think of it as a layer cake. planes fly over that NSA building all day long,
Yeah.
landing. And so, with some taking off, they'd be higher than that, but mostly chiefly on landing from the south. But if you're low, slow, and inside, they watch it. But it doesn't affect the Delta or the Salt Lake
There
airport
was no
patterns.
rerouting or anything.
No, I wish I could discuss that with you, and it's not because I won't, it's because I don't know enough. I just know that you have to think of airspace like a layer cake. And right down close to it, you can't go there.
Yeah.
Up higher, they go over all day long.
Yeah.
All day long. Anyone else? It's been nice to be with you. You should be proud as Utahns. I'm in a biscuit now that I'm out. I can tell you just how good your military units are in this state. When they deploy, I always like to tell my active duty friends that's when the A-team gets there. I felt that for years. I feel it even more so now that I've watched them fight for 12 years. You have exceptional military units in this state, and you should be proud of them, and they try to do things cost effectively for you taxpayers. So, thank you.